let's get a brief introduction on how to work with JavaScript inside the Atom environment and using that base local server project that I already showed you how to install. And prior to starting any of these videos from here on out, you may wish to go ahead and get yourself a fresh example folder where you clone the repository and then run npm install. I'm now sitting in that and I'm going to start up the local server. I have this set up so that I have Atom loaded over here where I can edit the files, and I'm going to keep Chrome handy right over here so that I can look at both of them side by side. Some things you're going to start to notice now. As we work in languages other than HTML, Atom will be able to track right along with those because it is a multi-language editor. Let's go ahead and go into public here and pull up the index.html. Now this is a very primitive index.html. Let's give it a little more pizzazz. I'm going to bring in my HTML Bootstrap Basic Starter, which I created in the previous unit. This is the page that will apply the basic Bootstrap styling to the page and will also set me up in the style that I'm used to. You'll notice not a whole lot changed over here, but it is definitely pulling in Bootstrap. Now something you may want to do here as you move forward is give yourself as much information as you can about the page that has been loaded. I highly recommend going into View, Developer, Developer Tools, or you might get used to the hotkey there if it makes sense to you. This pulls up those developer tools, which we've been working with from time to time. They're going to be very important from here on out as we learn to work with JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the device toolbar. We don't really need to play with the responsiveness anymore. And I do want to change where this is docked. I'm going to dock it to the bottom. This way I get all the developer information down here that I'm going to need. Make sure that you can see the console. This is the JavaScript console where you can actually issue JavaScript commands if you wish, but also where you'll be able to see input and output as well as any errors reported. Up here you'll also be able to see the page itself, and we'll go through some of these other options as they become important. For now, let's write some JavaScript. Anytime you learn a new programming language, and up until now we haven't really been learning programming languages. We learned a style language and a markup language. But JavaScript really is a proper programming language. Every time you learn a new one, there's a certain rite of passage, an initiation that must happen, usually called Hello World. This is a really simple program that you can write that allows you to see the basics of how you print something to the screen. And that's all it does. It gets you introduced to the syntax of the language. Now many of you probably already know JavaScript in the basics. So you can skip forward here a little bit if you don't need to learn the basics about JavaScript. However, it never hurts to review these things. And seeing them in the concepts and the context that I present them in is really useful. So if you do skim forward, do it gingerly. Now, let's go ahead and put some actual JavaScript code of our own in here. We're linking in some JavaScript code already. We're linking in jQuery and Bootstrap, but we can still put in some of our own. And we're just going to make it sure it comes in at the end after those two. We're going to create a new script tag. And this one, we're going to make an inline script tag. It will have an opening and a close, but it will not have a source in it. This means that the script goes actually right here in between the tags. At this point, all I need to do is issue a command. And the typical command that we do in order to create a simple output or a simple sort of hello world is we say document.write hello world. Now we can save this, and it should immediately get refreshed and loaded into our page. And there it is. It's going to look very unpleasing for right now, because all we did was actually tell it to write it into the document, which means it just literally gets appended right at the end of our body. It can be helpful to look at the actual sources here. And if we look at index, I'm going to close this off over here, you can see what it's actually output. This is what it received. And the script actually doesn't show hello world anywhere. Instead, if we go over and look at the elements, this shows us the actual structure of the page after that script has run. And that script modified the page. It took the document and it wrote the words "Hello World" into it. Just raw, sitting out in the middle of nowhere. That's normally very bad practice. So the first thing we can do to sort of improve this a little bit, let's put it inside something. We never want to leave it hanging out in nowhere. So let's go ahead and write in a p tag. Now this might get a little bit wonky because all of a sudden we are putting tags inside of tags here, or rather HTML inside of JavaScript. So you'll have to bear with it. But let's go ahead and do that and save it. Nothing really changes up here because we're still not following the rules of Bootstrap. But you'll notice now in the elements, Hello World shows up inside of a p tag just like you'd expect it to. And it's getting all the things applied to it that you would expect a tag to have applied. Let's go one step further with this. Let's talk about exactly what's happening right here. This line of JavaScript first grabs a global object called the document. We've already talked about this a little bit. You'll remember hearing about the document object model. That is accessed through the global object document. It contains a function called write. And so if we ever say document.write, it's going to take the document object model and append whatever we give it to that. It will then also interpret them and build any tags out of it that we specify. So here we specified a p tag, and you'll notice over here it renders that p tag just like it should. You can see up in the actual page heading that it highlights it and shows all the different properties of it, including the extra space that you always get at the end of a p tag. That's what that little orange bar is. This is a command that we use right now out of convenience, but that you will want to avoid at a later date. It's really a command that's meant just for playing around with JavaScript. But it does get us kind of what we're looking for here. Now, let's go back into the actual HTML and see how we can get these two to sort of play nicely. First of all, we haven't bothered to update this yet. Let's go ahead and do this. JavaScript hello world. And then the header will be my first JavaScript. And the section will be say hello JavaScript. And then we'll go ahead and save that. And let's give ourselves something new. I want to make sure that the response from JavaScript, the hello world, actually shows up right here. So I'm going to put a tag here for it. Typically, we would do this using a div or span tag, depending on how we want to be formatted. Keep in mind, a div tag takes block display styling, similar to a paragraph, and a span takes inline styling. I'm going to use a div here. And I'm not going to actually put anything in it because my intention is for it to be filled by the JavaScript. But in order for the JavaScript to be able to do that, it has to be able to find that div tag. There's several ways to go about this, but 99.9% of the time this will be done using an ID. We already saw IDs briefly when we were playing around with things like working with Bootstrap, as well as working with forms, and when we worked with the canvas, we needed to give our canvas element an ID so that we could find it in the JavaScript. We're going to do the exact same thing here. I'm going to give it the ID my content. And so now I can find this tag inside the document object model using its ID. Here's how this works. Again, I start with the global object document, which again is the document object model, the DOM, and I say find element, or I believe it's, excuse me, get element by ID. And then I list its ID. This function's a little different from the write function. The write function is what we call a side effect function. It changes the state of the world, and that's all it does. Many functions, however, compute something and give you a response. They return a value. This particular one is going to do that, and you probably saw this over in the canvas situation. It's going to give us back that element, assuming it finds it. And we need to store it in a variable. So we create a variable here, and we'll call it content. So we're going to search the document for the element with the ID myContent. If it finds it, it returns it back into this variable. If it doesn't find it, we'll simulate that in a moment, but it will create a sort of error that we would have to deal with. Then we can now say content dot inner HTML. This is a property that every element has. And I can attach to that the stuff that I was originally attaching to the very end of the document. And now this will be set into the HTML of that element. Basically, this content will be placed between the open and closed tags, aka the inner part of the tag. And then save this, and there it is. You can see it right here, hello world. Let's go ahead and look at the structure of the body as well. It's going to look a little bit odd because Bootstrap's doing some funny things, but the container is where our stuff is, and then we go into section, and then right here, div ID myContent contains within it a paragraph, hello world. So it basically took exactly what we typed in right here and placed it between the open and closed tags of div. This is how we usually output things using JavaScript. Now, let's do a few other things here just to get you used to working with the world of JavaScript. First, let's cause an error to happen. Right now, we've been writing things neatly. You guys might have actually already caused an error and you're wondering what you do to fix it. Let's create one. Let's say I screw up and accidentally just call this content. I forgot that the ID had the word by on the front of it. If I save this, a few interesting things are going to happen. First of all, I'm going to be confused because hello world does not show up. But if I have my developer tools open, it'll immediately pop up a little red X here with the number that tells you how many errors happened. Here it says uncaught type error. Cannot set property inner HTML of null. It tells you where this happens. It happened at index line 36. Now that might seem a little bit odd. If you come over here, it doesn't seem that that's line 36. Very often these line numbers don't quite line up. But if you click on it, it will take it to you in its line numbers. And its line numbers might be slightly different from the ones you have over here. So down here you can see exactly where it found the error. And it'll show it to you right in context. Cannot set property inner HTML of null. What does this mean? We were accessing the property inner HTML. Inner HTML means it's a property of whatever came before it, in this case content. And it's saying you can't set it because it's null. And it's saying it's the property of null, meaning that content is what's null here. So cannot set property inner HTML of null. When it says that of null, it's talking about the thing before the period. Content is null. You would then have to figure out, well, why is content null? Well, that means that the variable here, content, didn't get set right. And it was set in the line just before it. So what went wrong? And maybe then you can put two and two together and see that, oh, it should have been myContent. As soon as we fix that, again, the page will reload itself, and boom, there's hello world. You should work really hard to learn to understand these errors as they come up. They are there to be your first line of defense when something goes wrong, and I highly recommend getting used to speaking their language. It's a very common kind of debugging language that you'll see in many other languages that you might do in your programming career. They all talk about these things in the same sort of way. Now remember, null refers to something that is undefined, something that has no content. And so when it's said you can't set the property of null, it means that content is null, and therefore it doesn't have any property inner HTML. And so you have to ask the question, why was it null? Well, up here is where it should have become something, so something must be wrong with that line. And you can deduce that you got the wrong element. Very often when something like that happens, it means that the element, for whatever reason, did not get set properly. You want to make sure that you check your stats right there. The last thing I want to show you here is how to keep everything nice and tidy. At this point, we're venturing into another aspect of the larger design problem. The design problem focuses on, first, the semantics of the content, its meaning, and we've talked about how that's HTML. The second part of the problem talks about the visual style of it, and that's done with CSS. The last part is the dynamic, responsive nature of the overall web design, and that's going to be achieved with JavaScript. And just like when we use CSS, we really don't want it sitting in the middle of our code. You'll find many older web pages still do that, but in this class, I'm going to require that you always put it out in its own separate file, just like I showed you how to do with your CSS. You can use a link tag, use an href to link in your CSS. You'll want to do the same thing here with your JavaScript. Let's do that. So we're going to want to take these out, and actually we're going to make them look an awful lot like the ones above them. Here we have external JavaScript files that we're pulling in. We don't do it with a link tag, we do it with a script tag, but the actual purpose is almost identical. Let's go ahead and create ourselves a JavaScript file. I'm going to create a new blank file. I'm going to grab our couple lines of JavaScript here and bring them over into that file and then save it. And remember, it doesn't really pick up the type of the file until you save it. Now this is important. Make sure you place it in the public directory. It needs to be in the same folder as your index.html. And in this case, we might as well call it index.js. Just like we did with our CSS, it's very common to give it the same name as the file it's being used in. Eventually, we'll have many of these working together to solve a problem, and then we'll give them different names. But in this class, just name it the same as the file it's used in. We say save, and then it starts to recognize that it's JavaScript and highlight it properly. Now, some important things are going to happen when you're working in a JS file specifically. Once you have your code in a separate JS file, we no longer need to list it over here, so we can delete that out, and we can then say source equals and give it the name of the file. Because it's in the exact same directory as our index.html, we do not need to specify anything else. If it were in a subdirectory, we would specify that here relative to the folder public, but it's not in our case. There's one very important thing to note that's going on here. When you include a link tag, you don't have to have the closing tag. Sometimes you'll see them self-closing, as many other tags are that we use. But when you use a script tag, you must include the closing script. You cannot make it self-closing, and you cannot leave out the closing script tag. Many browsers will simply fail to load the script unless you leave both of them in this position. You'll notice that we did that with jQuery and Bootstrap, and that was not an accident. This is a weird requirement, and you can Google around about exactly why this is. There are many wise people out there that have tried to explain it, and it's not a simple reason why you have to do this. But just be wary. Don't do what you do with link, where you just leave it off. You need the closing script tag. Let's go ahead and save this, and you'll notice it's still working over here. One other thing that's nice is index.js is now off as its own file. And that means that as you get errors and line numbers, you'll be able to see these things much more clearly. Over here in index.js, Atom is now going to recognize this as a proper JavaScript file. And if everything is set up correctly, it will start linting this file for us. This assumes that you installed all the things that you were supposed to. In particular, make certain that you had installed npm, that you ran npm install when you created this. Everything else should just hook up. You do need the APM or the Atom package that sets up ESLint. That's what we're using. Remember, ECMA script is often referred to as ES, and that's the more generic term for JavaScript. ESLint is a simple program that goes through and looks for errors in your JavaScript. Now, it's going to do a few things that you might find frustrating. First of all, it's going to require that you include semicolons everywhere. You may not know this, but you actually don't have to include semicolons in JavaScript. And you might have occasionally seen me leaving them out when I was writing my own code. Really, there's a big argument amongst JavaScript programmers as to whether those semicolons should be there or not. I leave it entirely up to you. But by default, it's going to look for them, as I think this is a more basic way to begin. If this really bothers you, you can change it. I'll show you how in just a moment. The other thing it's going to require is that you use single quotes on your strings. Here I've typed it in with double quotes. Those that have worked with JavaScript before will know that it can accept either. If you want to use single quotes, you can. If you want to use double quotes, you can. And there's very good reasons for this. However, the default settings for ESLint are going to look for single quotes everywhere. This is something I recommend you get used to. Try and use single quotes everywhere you can. You'll notice I remain pretty consistent about this as I code. Whenever I'm typing in HTML, I'll always list my attributes using double quotes. Whenever I'm typing in JavaScript, I'll always do them using single quotes. This will make life a lot easier when we start mixing the two, which is right around the corner. If either of these are so annoying you cannot stand it, let me show you how you can change it. This is one of those extra files that's over here. You'll find one called .eslintrc.js. This is a JavaScript file. It's one that ESLint uses to configure itself. There's lots of things in here that might be a bit confusing. You don't need to worry about most of them. The two rules you'll be interested in are right here. On line 12, we tell it to check for quotes and to list an error unless there's single quotes. If you prefer double, just change this to the word double. For semicolons, you'll notice on line 13, it uses the semi rule, and it's going to list an error always when you leave them out. If you wish to change this so that it doesn't require them, simply delete line 13, or you can comment it out. This is JavaScript after all. Either of these changes should immediately be recognized. You simply need to go back over to the file and save it again, and it will then start using those new rules. There are many other rules you can customize inside of ESLint, and the more adventuresome among you might want to go out and research those. However, I've configured it in such a way that it should lead you down the right path. Keep your code looking clean and neat. It will force you to indent in a way that is most common and consistent. It will keep you from using the console unless you really mean it, and that's important. And it will also get you using quotes and semicolons consistently. This is all good stuff. And you should always strive to resolve every single error that ESLint gives you. If you're going along and typing and it gives you an error, figure out what that error is. It's listing it right here. You'll see them listed over here. Figure out what it is and fix it. If I see you submitting code to me that still has some errors in it, I'm going to assume either you didn't get ESLint working or you don't know what those errors mean, and neither of those are good things. To be the best programmer you can, you want to use the information that the editor is giving you. So make certain that you resolve these errors. Let's look at one last tool that we can use for debugging purposes. Over here in index.html, I've identified a div that I can call out and work with, and I can fill it in by using its ID over here in the JavaScript. This is great if we want to actually modify the page, but sometimes we'd like to give ourselves some information without modifying the page. We don't necessarily want to say hello to the whole world, only to the developer. For this, we have something called the console. If you've worked with basic languages before, like Java or C++, this is what's called standard out. And essentially, this is what standard out is going to be for us when we're working in a client environment like a browser. The console is only visible if you go over into the developer tools. And we've got it open down here at the bottom. If for some reason you don't have this, just click the console tab and it'll take up the whole page then. I'm going to leave it on that for a moment because we're going to start printing some stuff to the console. With the console, you have many options, the most typical of which is console.log. When I say console, it looks up console on the global namespace, and it will find the console that belongs to the browser window. This is actually window.console that we're writing to, but that window can always be implied. The log function says, please log the following information. And then we just need to give it some information. Say test. And then we'll put the semicolon on there. Now, you will get a warning from ESLint because console statements should not be left. Whenever you've finished debugging or doing whatever you were trying to do with the console, you should remove them. Now, there is a way around this. You can use something other than console.log, but I don't encourage this. Use console.log while you're trying to debug things and figure things out, and then you can delete them before you submit it. And I mark them as warnings so that you remember to delete them. I don't want to see these things when you submit it. Why? Because they slow down the rendering of your web page. Listening to the console actually takes time, a surprisingly large amount of time. So don't leave it in there in your final web page ever. Let's go ahead and save this. And you'll notice it immediately reloads this and reruns it. And this is a test shows up down here, right in the middle. It doesn't come up in the web page, only in the console. If the developer tools weren't open, I'd never even see it. So this is a way to talk to developers and coders of your web page rather than to the intended audience of the page itself. We will use this a lot. Let's go ahead and bring the developer tools back up. One other thing that's really handy is it tells you exactly where it came from. Let's see how we could have used this to debug our previous situation. Remember, we had intentionally misnamed this in order to create an error on line 2. And when we save this, here we've got that same error coming back. It says it's on index.js line 2. And now that we're in an actual JS file, those line numbers line up, which is a great thing. Let's see what we could do to fix this. Let's insert a line just before line 2, and let's do console.log and just log content right there. Content is a variable, and anything can really be passed to the log as long as JavaScript knows how to turn it into a string. But just about everything can be turned into a string in JavaScript. Let's save this, and now you'll see here we get one output just before that that says null. It was generated by index.js line 2, and there it is. It might be a little hard to interpret this, so you can actually decorate this a little bit. You can say content is, and then add content to it. And that'll build a more complete sentence. Content is null. Uh-oh, we don't want that. This is the standard way to build strings up when you're trying to build things, and JavaScript does this in a very flexible way. You'll see lots more of this as time goes on. Here's one other more modern way of doing this. This is something that you can do if you want to, but you don't have to. I'm going to show you something called a template string. A template string starts with a different character. It looks like the single quotes, but it's not. This is actually the tick mark. It's usually right next to the 1 key, and it's sort of a back accent character. Inside that, I'm going to now type in content is, and then I'm going to fill in this area with content. Notice here I get the exact same results over in the console. It shows it fills in null for content. This syntax right here where we say $ curly brace allows it to recognize and pull out the value of whatever comes between it. Let's go ahead and fix this now and change this back to my content as the ID. We don't change this. Content is still the name of the variable, but we're going to change the ID back to being correct. And let's save this. Here's what we get now. It says content is object, HTML div element. So it's a div. It's a div tag, and that's exactly what we expect. One last tip. If we log it all by itself as a variable to the log, Chrome and Safari and all the other browsers will do something smart. It will actually let you go into that div, and it will show it to you in context up there. So this can be a real handy way to explore variables. It doesn't just print it out as a string if it's something more sophisticated. This is a really cool feature of the console, so make sure you take advantage of it.